Welcome. This is the Alternating History with Story, Part 1 panel. If this is not the panel you're expecting to be at, you may leave.
No, you can't.
No, we're locking the doors. I am Sandra. I publish as S.G. Wong. I had the honor of having this is my idea, this panel idea, and they accepted. I'm very excited. So I get to moderate. I'm also going to participate as a panelist. I don't always do that, but my fellow panelists have been very gracious to allow me to do that. So for the most part, I like to have my panelists do the talking and all that stuff. And if you would be kind enough to hold your questions till the end, that would be really great, because I really like to have everyone have a chance to say what they'd like to say about the topic. And so we will start. So just very quickly, just to get myself out of the way, as I said, I publish as S.G. Wong. I publish alternate history, hardboiled detective novels and short stories that also have ghosts and magic. And I will let these lovely, smart people introduce themselves. This is Barb Gawler-Smith, Susan MacGregor, Marty Chan, L.S. Johnson.
I'm Barb Gawler-Smith. I have a historical fantasy trilogy out with Edge, who is here, and a contemporary romantic comedy, and I hope that's not my phone because it sounds like it. That'll do for now.
I'm Susan MacGregor. I have a trilogy out. The third book is just coming out this December. It's historical fantasy as well, with a fairly healthy dollop of romance in it. Kind of considered actually in some ways almost a cross genre, but that's just what happened. Set in Spain in about 1550, where my protagonist runs afoul of the Spanish Inquisition. And then she and her band of gypsies, whom she meets up with, end up running from them to the New World, where they run into all kinds of interesting things, kind of based on history and myths in history, like the Fountain of Youth and voodoo and all that kind of cool stuff.
I wish I'd said that.
Oh. You got to write it first, Barb.
No, I mean, I had more to say.
We'll come back.
Okay.
Don't worry.
Oh, are you sure?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Marty?
I yield my time to Bart. No.
Nice try.
My name is Marty Chan, and I have 2/3 of a trilogy, the Eric Weiss Chronicles, steampunk fantasy series, in which Nikola Tesla teams up with a young Harry Houdini.
Cool.
All right, I'll end it there. Can't top cool.
I'm L.S. Johnson. I write weird fiction and fantasy, more often than not set in the past. I unfortunately never thought of the Tesla Houdini idea, and now I'm really jealous about that.
Too bad.
I did,
so
however,
sad.
kill off Jean-Jacques Rousseau in a story once, so I want points for that.
Okay, excellent.
Good.
Well, we've
What
noted
can
that
I
down.
say?
Yes, now Barb Gawler-Smith would like to take the floor again.
Yes. Well, mine is a Celtic versus Roman trilogy, so it's set in the 1st century BC, and the magic element is part of the old Celtic mythos, and Julius Caesar is in it. Not Tesla, though. It was like way cooler.
So, LS, I missed which time period that you write.
I have written in everything from the late 17th century up to the hoary past of the 1970s, which I also consider a historical writing at
Yes.
this point.
Okay, great. And then I have the 1930s not covered, but that's what I dabble in. Okay, so my first question for everyone to talk about is, why did you choose alternate history rather than straight up historical fiction?
Are you looking at me?
I'm looking at whoever. I'm going to look at L.S. Johnson
Good.
down the way.
I think when you write fantasy, the better question is why write history when you could just make up the whole thing and not have to worry about actually getting it right. But for me, the fantasy is a way to kind of look sideways at the history and perhaps open it up in a way that straight historical fiction might not get to.
I would echo Ellis's comment that I love the notion of looking at things sideways. Certainly with the Eric Weiss Chronicles, in real history, there was not a relationship between Nikola Tesla and Harry Houdini, but I kept thinking it would be really interesting to put them together in a novel and you look back at history, there are some interesting pairings of relationships.
Yeah.
There was actually a relationship between Harry Houdini and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And that was fascinating. But then you sort of limit yourself to, okay, so exactly how much can I play with that relationship if I want to write about that? And if it turns out they've only had a passing friendship for 6 months and then they fell apart, then you can't really do much
Right.
beyond there if you're writing historical fiction.
Right. Susan?
I didn't want to totally slam the Catholic Church. As the Spanish Inquisition was Roman Catholicism, right? Sort of with a Spanish tint to it. So I created a very reflective religion, very paternalistic, and I contrasted that with more of a pagan religion, which is what the Gypsies follow. So that kind of gave me a chance to explore some of those ideas and play them off against each other. Also, I think fantasy, like Jennifer said, I just didn't want to do the straight historical. I wanted to throw the magic in there, and with fantasy, that's kind of what you do.
The question, in case you've forgotten, Barb, is why did you choose alternate history and not just a straight-up historical fiction?
I actually didn't.
Okay.
I started to do a straight Celtic history set in that time period, and I couldn't quite get away from the magic element, and so it was the magic that altered the history. But I didn't alter very much of it because we use real characters and a lot of real people, and a lot of the things that they did are well documented in history. So we had to kind of move around that and move them into the magical system. So if you would say it was alternate history, it's only alternate history at the small level of our characters rather than historically. These kinds of things, the things that we talked about would never show up in modern history. So we didn't really choose that.
What did you mean when you said it was the magic? You couldn't get away from the magic. Yeah.
The ancient Celts used to, we think, we don't know very much, we think they believed in the true elemental of trees, and that people could transform themselves into trees. And trees were very sacred to them, we think. And so that became the foundation of our magic, but having people turn into trees became very unwieldy. So we thought, well, maybe they could turn into a bush.
Yeah. You mean shrubbery?
A shrubbery, and eventually we came to some changes, but we kept that same essential thing where people could do this, but then we had to come up with a reason like, well, no, not everybody could just do it, and just because you were druid didn't mean that you could do it too. And so we had to come up with some alternate magical vehicle by which this magic could happen.
So have we all written something then that there's magic in our fiction? I'm not familiar with yours, Jennifer.
I don't know if it's magic per se. One of the things that interests me is the history of science, the development of science, and so in the trilogy that I'm working on, I'm playing with the idea that alchemy actually keeps going, that alchemy has come up with just enough seemingly magical transformations to keep going as a separate avenue of thought. So I guess it's in a way we're playing with that idea. What does it mean? Like, what context isn't magic and what context is it science? And especially in like 17th to 18th century, you can really play with those definitions a lot.
Right. That sounds really fascinating. Marty, does your Eric Weiss, do you have magic in there? I haven't read them yet. I have them. I just haven't read them.
I don't think it has magic per se. There's an alternate dimension that opens up, so I guess in that sort of category it might have some elements of magic more than science.
Right.
It sort of allows me to play a little bit, because with the series, I think like with anything when you're writing fantasy or science fiction, you're using it as a way to sort of reflect the world that we live in and ourselves. It's just through a different lens. And with the Eric Weiss Chronicles, when I came down to it, I kept thinking, well, it's an interesting story to pursue, the relationship between Houdini and Tesla. But that time period to me was really fascinating because of the immigration, the waves of immigration. You had a lot of Irish coming, European immigration, but you also had Asian immigration, and the way the Asian immigrants were treated versus European immigrants was far different. And I kept thinking I would love to create an allegory out of this series so that the treatment, to sort of showcase the treatment of Asian immigrants coming to North America during that period.
Right.
But I wanted to put it sideways, and so rather than making it Asian immigrants, I
Right.
decided that it would be people coming from another dimension. And the thing that's interesting is I take the elements of how the Chinese and the Japanese were treated, and I morph them into how
Right.
these other dimensional people are
Right.
treated.
Right.
And so it just allowed for some social commentary, which wasn't as on the nose as if I actually said,
Yes.
this is how the Chinese and the Japanese were treated.
Oh, that's fascinating. If I can just insert myself as panelists rather than moderators, I took that idea, I took the 1930s and I took LA just because I'm a huge fan of Raymond Chandler, and that was when he was writing. And I imagined an alternate history of the Chinese having colonized rather than Europeans. And so I've turned it around by having my protagonist be a white woman in a Chinese culture. And it also mirrors it flips my own experience growing up in a Western culture here in Canada. But so that brings up another question, which is, when you chose, maybe by accident or maybe consciously, mindfully, to twist history or to look at it sideways, what was your motivation as an artist? What did you want to express by doing that?
I have no idea.
No, just have fun. I mean that's okay
write the
too, right? You
story.
don't have to.
Just write the story.
Yeah.
That was all I wanted to do, was tell a story.
I want to get back to the magic for a minute, because
Okay.
I want to talk about my magic. My magic, it really isn't magic in my book. They're psychic gifts. So I have my protagonist, who is an empath. She's a healer, but when she touches someone, she picks up on what's wrong with them. She's sensitive. There's actually a psychic term for that called clairsentience. Okay, it's clear feeling. All the clairs. If any of you are familiar with any psychic gifts, there's 4 major clairs. There's clair meaning clear thinking, clear feeling, clear seeing, clear hearing. And if you have any psychic ability at all, then you would be familiar with that. So that's the magic that I play with in my books, as well as mediumship and channeling, that kind of thing. So, yeah, so for some people magic, for some of us, not really magic, but something that you already kind of do. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. So then, talking about, because this panel is about alternating history with story, when you are looking or doing your research, what did you do for your research?
I went down a rabbit hole and I never came back.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the joys of writing sort of alternate history is that you get to do the research. And because my novel was set in the Gilded Age in New York, I mean, there's a lot of great stuff that you can take a look at. And there are certainly books that you can take out from the library and read, but I go, there's no substitute for on-the-ground research. And for the first book, I found myself a grant to get myself to New York, where I could go into the archives, the New York Historical Society archives, and just start sifting through all the material to get a sense of the place.
Yeah.
And because New York really has, unlike Edmonton, it tries to retain its architectural roots. Then once I sort of had downloaded enough information, I would just start walking through the city, because in my mind I sort of mapped out what potentially could happen in the story, and I thought, you know what, if I'm going to have my character run from the Bowery to the Hudson River, how long will it take?
Right.
So Michelle and my wife and I, we had to start walking through the city, and of course we went there, I think it was in June, and there was a heat wave, so it was like plus 35. I remember we got on one of those the Circle Tour ship cruises around the city, so I could get a sense of that. I didn't research very well there because I passed out from heat stroke.
Oh, wow.
So on the ground research can be quite exciting.
Did you put that in your books?
No.
Did you have them running around in sweltering heat?
I might in the third book.
Yeah.
But I think the danger of the research is then you start getting so fascinated with the research and the world that you just go, oh, here's something else that I could put in the book. Or, oh my goodness, this is way more interesting than the idea that I had.
Yeah.
And you can get yourself lost. So my strategy going in and researching was to go, I'm going to do enough research to get a general impression of the era and the geography that I want to write about. Then I'm going to shape the story. And once I kind of know where the story and the characters are, then I'll go back and do specific research to address it. So that way it sort of curbed this anything goes kind of research approach.
Yeah. Am I right in guessing we all love to do research?
It's a love-hate relationship.
Is it?
Yeah.
Speak more about that, Susan and Barb, because I love it, and Jennifer was nodding too.
Oh, yeah. Well, it is a rabbit hole. You find something that you really enjoy learning about, and you start reading more and looking more and talking to people, and then you start going to museums and go, oh, I could write a story about that. Oh, I could write a story about that. I could write a story about that. And you become totally immersed to the point where you don't know where to go first. And then you start writing, and then you say, oh, every moment of every day, you're sort of stopping yourself from looking up something. And did it really look like that? Was it really white? Were the plants correct? Was the color correct? And it's a never-ending spiral.
I kind of did a lot of reading before, to get myself in the setting initially and get a sense of the actual history during 1550 with the Spanish Inquisition at the time and all of that, as well as what was going on in Europe at the time, because the books start from a small area and they get bigger and bigger and bigger to kind of encompass the expansion into the new world. So I had to do a lot of research on place, setting, history of the time, the mythos of the time, the religions like voodoo and that sort of thing coming from West Africa that were being mixed up, before they were actually mixed with Catholicism. I had to look at the actual African religions and the melding of those. So that's kind of what I was looking at. The problem I had with research is I would write some of the book, and then I'd say, okay, I have to look this up now because this scene is coming up. I need to know more about this. So I'd stop the writing, I'd do the research, I'd scribble in my book, my notes, and then I'd go ahead and I'd write the scene. I'd carry on writing, I'd do more research on something else. So I have a notebook that's full of notes about plot, notes about character and setting, notes about research, and none of it is organized.
No.
Didn't think that would be a problem until I sent the manuscript into my publisher, and she's wonderful, but she's a stickler. How could this be? Blah 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 blah. How could this? For example, here's an example. The heads on a sailing ship. How could they possibly be stinking and dirty? Because the bow of the ship is always bouncing into the waves. It's being cleaned up. Well, I had to go back through my notes and find where I had a little notation that the heads were filthy. They were called the jardines by the Spanish as kind of a joke, because they were just revolting. But I had to go through my notes and through books again to prove my point with her, right? Which was good. It put me on very solid ground in terms of my research, but I hadn't expected to do that. So if I will, the next book that I'm going to do after these, I'm being really, really organized with my research and keeping that separate from my plot notes and all that. So
Binders.
Binders. Well,
Binders. I have binders. Before I even start the book, I have a book that's kind of sitting there languishing, but I have a binder that's this thick, and it's got all, in grade 8, all the tags, and I have clothing, I have textiles and weapons and household items and who was the king and what the whole political system was and what what the houses look like and pictures and web links, and it's huge. And that's, we've written like, you know,
Bible in a way, isn't it?
it is a Bible, and so that when you go, but when you were talking about feet on the ground, we wrote this book, and it's set in Brittany in France. I've never been to France, and we had Julius Caesar watching this battle on a hillside or a promontory, and there's only one small promontory, and it's called Caesar's Lookout or something. So it's a real place. But when I looked at the map and the old maps of where I looked at like where the water levels were, 2,000 years ago and all that kind of stuff, I realized he couldn't have been there because it was too far away from where the battle was. So Josh and his wife went to France, and they went and they started scouring that whole area. And he not only found a place that was perfect, he also found a place that, the one place in the whole country that actually has a cliff where there could have been a cave, 2,000 years ago. And we were so delighted because we didn't have to play loose with the geography in that case.
Yeah. So how do you organize your research, Marty and Jennifer?
Scrivener. Scrivener makes an excellent series Bible program. You can dump everything in there, PDFs, images, web links, all sorts of stuff. And I used to do paper, and I was going through the same thing you were going through, of trying to backtrack to find things. So this summer's project was actually moving everything onto the computer so I can search. And I tried a personal wiki and just having folders, but Scrivener has been the best for me. I can also tag things and pull things together by tags. It's been really useful.
That's great.
So for people who don't use Scrivener, what do you think could be an analog?
Tiny little yellow stickies. They don't work as
Not
well
that
as you
kind of
think they
analog.
would. But Microsoft
Spreadsheets?
Word
Yeah.
has a comment when you do the review section of your manuscript. You can put in comments to
Yeah.
yourself on sections, so
Yeah.
that's a way of working in notes.
Okay.
I found that was pretty useful when I was going through
It is.
the manuscript. And at a certain point, just to sort of deviate a little bit, at a certain point, you always have to remember that you are in control of the research. The research is not in control of you. And I'll share a quick anecdote. There's an Alberta author based in Edmonton. Her name is Laurel Diedrich Main, and her book is Awake for the Dreamland, and it's one of the 5 nominees for the Alberta Reader's Choice Awards. And the book is set during World War II, and it's about a love triangle. And it's during the wars, one person gets separated from the other two, and a good part of the story is carried through correspondence between the 3 characters. And Laurel, at one of the panels, talked about how she would go out and find veterans and get their letters. And she sifted through piles and piles of these like heart-wrenching letters between soldiers and their loved ones. And she said she wanted to get them all into the book.
Yeah.
But then she stopped herself while her editor stopped her and said, you have to pick. And I think she went with like, I have to have an arbitrary number to start from, and just wean down those. And it forced her to then put a critical eye to the research in the same way that as writers, we put a critical eye when we revise our manuscripts. We go, I love this chapter, I love this character, but it's not doing anything for the overall story, so out it goes.
Right.
So I think the same philosophy has to apply when you're doing your research.
That's actually leads to the next question, which is when do you stop research? So Susan, it sounded like you intersperse research with actually writing, and not everybody, I don't do that, for example. I like to do my research before I start writing, and then of course there will be things that come up, and I'll put a note. I have to come back to that in the second draft. But not everybody works that way.
That's kind of what I did, though.
You do. Okay, so
Initially. Yeah,
so when do
when I
you stop?
started.
Yeah, when do you start research and when you start writing? How do you know? it's time to come back out of the
I
rabbit
don't know.
hole?
It's just kind of a gut feel. You know, if you feel you've satisfied what you wanted to accomplish in a certain scene, you know, without putting in too much. It's
Yeah.
like you say, Marty. You know, you've got to know, you know, what's enough and what isn't enough. A lot of the time, I feel like I haven't put in enough because you read so much, you learn so much,
Yeah.
and yet you think, well, you know, what serves the story here, and what would be appropriate, particularly in dialogue. You know, you don't want to go on in dialogue because then you range into exposition. You know, what would be realistically talked about, you know, in a certain scene, right? So I guess that's where I stop.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I think Jennifer, you were going to say?
I had a very brief career as an academic, and the
I hear a story behind that.
and so when I was doing my master's, we had a graduate writing workshop to write academic papers, the kind that you actually present at a conference. And the professor gave me the advice to make the research fit the thesis, not write the thesis off the research. You come up with the thesis first, and then you research that, rather than just diving into the research, you know, full on, and then trying to extrapolate a thesis out of that. So I actually wrote, for the trilogy that I'm doing in the mid-18th century, I actually wrote the rough draft of, I read like 2 or 3 broad books, wrote the entire rough draft, and then actually started drilling into all the history about the clothes and, you know, maritime stuff, everything. And I had just like a lot of square brackets that were like, you know, shirt, boat, you know, gun, so that, you know, to know to come back later and actually fill in what they are. But
Right.
it just made it, I think there was 2 times when I wrote something that just couldn't absolutely happen and had to go back and redo that. But I think overall the amount of time that I saved was
Right.
worth it.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
Nice
did
idea.
you want to say something about that, Barb? No? Marty?
I'm going to reference Kenny Rogers' song, The
Gotta know.
Gambler. You got to know when to hold them,
Yeah.
when to fold them.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And, I mean, you learn so much doing research, but you don't want to tell your reader everything you learned, because that would be mean.
So, okay, my next question is, what was the, because I had asked you beforehand, if you had any funny anecdotes about your research, about talking to someone, anything like that.
It's not on the question.
It was in the Facebook group.
Heat stroke on.
Heat stroke?
Heat stroke.
Is that funny?
It was funny for my wife. Passed out.
So, I mean, in general, do you find that when you're doing research, you know, do you think you're using a different part of your brain than your creative writing
Yeah.
brain? Yeah.
Being much more analytical, so using a little bit of your left brain to see, is this going to fit, is this not going to fit? So, yeah. And I do have a funny anecdote. Well, it was
Please.
funny for Josh. Josh is my co-writer. for
Please
this
share.
Whole thing. It's funny for him. I had to write a scene. And, you know, we numbered all our scenes because that was the only way we could keep track of who was doing what. And so every scene had sort of a goal. And so I wrote this scene, and I poured my heart into it. I thought, actually, it was really good, and it made me cry, and I felt really good about it. And Josh read this scene, and he said, "Oh my God, Barb, this is so good. This is really, really good. We can't use it because I killed someone in the scene." And he said, "He dies way too soon." So the entire scene went. He thought it was funny. I kind of think it's funny now.
But do you
Not at
mean,
the time,
do you
though.
mean that it was a historical figure?
No, it was
Oh,
one of our
okay.
characters that
Okay.
we made up. It was so good. Just like fell out of a window and was pierced by spears. And it was like this kid. It was horrible. But that's another panel.
One aspect of the research that was really fun for me is Beyond New York, because it's about Harry Houdini. I had to learn more about Harry Houdini and some of the things that he did, some of his magic tricks and some of his escapes. And I'm more sort of a visceral learner or kinetic learner. So I'm reading all about his straitjacket, and I'm trying to figure out, well, how does it work? And so what I did was I found an online magic store that sold straitjackets.
Oh, gosh.
And
Time.
I remember it showed up in the mail. I was like, oh, look at this. It's a canvas jacket. I wonder how it works. So I put it on. My wife strapped me in. I sort of read the instructions on how to get out. And I think I was there for about 20 minutes, sweating. Are you saying 30 minutes? Okay, my wife's in the audience telling me that it's 30 minutes. And I remember it was the most, like if I had done this in public, it would be just hilarious of people trying to see this like grown man struggling in a straitjacket. But it was really fun because I got a sense of, like when I was 11, 12 years old, I liked stage magic, and I got to revisit stage magic, and doing the research helped me sort of relive my childhood dream. And I wound up, I think of all the royalties I've earned from this series, it has all gone into magic tricks. So,
Really?
Sweet.
That's great.
I'm just collecting them like jars of urine, like Howard Hughes. Don't actually learn anything.
Nice. So then, that's great. What has been the most fun thing in your research? The fun things. Yeah.
The drugs, for me, the drugs. Not that I've done them, I don't do them, but I really find
I
it,
love
you
that
know,
disclaimer.
yeah, no,
Just so
just fascinating about some of the poisons that are used in voodoo, and it's kind of cool. And I introduced one plant in my first book, which is based on datura. I call it datura, but datura is a what do you call that? Psychoactive, psychoactive drug. Anyway, it's a psychedelic, and if you take too much, it paralyzes you, and you just don't move. But it was really cool to find out later by book 3 that is very much used in creating a zombie. Well, one of the poisons in creating a zombie. So it's kind of neat. That kind of stuff was kind of cool.
So that you're talking about real plants that you discovered in your research.
Yeah, but I changed the name slightly. That's one of the things that I changed slightly. Yeah, and the place names as well.
Right.
So one word of caution, if you are writing about poisons and you're trying to do research, when you call the library reference section, explain what you're doing before you ask about the poisons.
So in addition to on-the-ground research, especially Marty, because you mentioned that's what you really focused on, well, you had the opportunity to focus on for your Eric Weiss books. What other kinds of research do you use? Because we want to provide some value for any of the writers in the audience, places they can go that maybe they're not familiar with.
I have found that, my stories are often set in Europe, and state archivists, national archivists, are wonderfully helpful people that will even practically write your scenes for you, because you will ask them about something and they'll go into elaborate detail trying to describe it to you, and you get these huge paragraphs of like, so if you were walking in Venice on 1742, this is what the promenade would have looked like, and you would have seen these people, and it's like, and I'll just copy and paste that and put that right in.
And then acknowledge them, right? You just thank them in the acknowledgement. Or you cite them. So do you cite your sources in your fiction?
I have a whole running acknowledgements thing. Yeah.
Okay. Susan, Marty, B. What else? What do you use for research other than on the ground? If you're lucky enough, go to Spain.
Every book available. I borrowed books from friends, some of which I've actually returned. Libraries, interlibrary loans, and a lot of our research was done before internet. So when like Wikipedia came out, it's like, yeah, I already knew that. I already knew that. Writing experts, finding out when did things like when did they first start using stirrups on horses. And the person that we talked to, he thanked me. He said, you have no idea how much that pisses me off when I see some historical picture or read a historical novel in which the horse tack is wrong, and just how far can a horse jump? So you talk to equestrians, and it's really far. Just everything. But people love to talk about what they do. And so if you're writing a book about airplanes, talk to someone who knows about airplanes, not just a pilot, but like your flight engineers and the people that work on airplanes and whatever it is. And they will give you so much information, like you were saying. They're just thrilled to pieces,
Right.
and I regret that we did not keep a list. It would have been hundreds of names long.
Right.
Yeah. I'll just add kind of a strange one. Social media, believe it or not. I had I was looking for some really accurate books on how the Spanish galleon is built. And I just kind of put it out there on Facebook, and I got a bunch of answers from some friends who said, well, hey, try this book through this press. And I ended up, I couldn't get it from my Kindle, so I ended up ordering it from the publishing house. And it was great. It's just a tiny little book, but just chock-a-block full of everything that I needed for, the Atlantic crossing, what they might have had to endure in 1550. So it was great.
Yeah, awesome. One quick thing is I have not had a grant to go down to LA and look at the archives. So I do most of my research online. And I mean, we all know Wikipedia is not your source material, but if you look at the source material that they cite, you can sometimes find really neat sources for yourself to go down the rabbit hole and for you to track down and read. So Wikipedia is not going to be your end point, but it can be a starting point. Yeah.